Good morning, everyone. I'm Peter Weitznegger. I'm the Executive Director of the SSC Investment Group. We're so thrilled to welcome you this morning in person and everyone online to the Risky Business webinar. Lots of people are talking about basically climate change, low carbon economy, civil rights, human rights. Oftentimes it's really not connected. We bring it together this morning with a great panel. I think it's, but before I introduce our moderator, I just want to shout out to the tech, Antonio, and thank you for your help this morning and yesterday, and Cynthia, we couldn't be here without your help, really appreciate it. So I want to introduce our moderator, Michael Fredericks. He's the state treasurer of Illinois. As such as he's like the chief investment officer overseeing a lot of money in Illinois. So thank you, Michael, for coming this morning. I really appreciate it. With no further ado, I'll just turn it over to you, Michael, and you'll run with it. Thank you, appreciate it.
Dieter, thank you. And these microphones are now on, we're ready to go. So before we move on to our speakers, let's set a little context for our conversation today. The fact that you're here leads me to believe you have some idea of what we're talking about. And my guess is if you are here today, you realize that the world is facing a climate crisis. And we know that we have a narrow window of time here to keep global warming below the 1.5 degrees to avert a catastrophic crisis. So given that, governments and industries around the world are undergoing a major transformation to a world with net zero carbon emissions. Many industries and businesses will be completely transformed and look radically different in the years ahead, including oil and gas companies, but also car companies, electric utilities. So we're already seeing the changes, and we see more coal plants closing, more electric vehicles on the road, and more aggressive climate policies at all levels. Ultimately, every business will be significantly affected by the transition to a net zero economy. So given these facts, companies have a responsibility to their investors, and that's why we're here today, and to their communities and to their workers to prepare for this transition. And further, they have a vested interest in ensuring that the way they transition is done right. We can't let them bury their heads in the sand and pretend like they don't need to make any changes. But how we get to net zero matters. Transition decisions need to be guided by sound principles. Companies need to consider the long-term strategy, and they need to ensure the actions they take are just, equitable, transparent, and sustainable. A climate transition that ignores the interests of workers and communities is not viable. Similarly, a climate transition that only deepens income and racial inequality is not sustainable. Put another way, companies and investors have a responsibility to manage the impact of decarbonization on workers and communities. That is what we mean by a just transition. Electrification of mobility and the shift to electric vehicles, or EVs for short, is a major part of the climate transition. Transportation represents 29% of global emissions, of US emissions. While decarbonization and transportation sector is absolutely critical, there are many concerns about the potential for unintended negative impacts, and that presents risks to investors like us. A transition that fosters deunionization, environmental injustice, human rights abuses, and ecosystem degradation will create new rights and public opposition that could derail transition efforts. So what are the challenges we're facing to a transition in transportation? Auto manufacturing provides 837,000 good family supporting jobs in the US. We need a public and private transportation system that allows all communities to thrive. Electric vehicle batteries contain metals that are mined in a manner that can be destructive to natural ecosystems and involve human rights abuses. So what can we as investors do to balance these issues and address these risks? These are the topics we'll be discussing here today. So our first speaker will be joining us over Zoom from Alabama. Mr. Jeremy Kimbrell is joining us, and Dieter, I think, is going to pull him up. Jeremy is a CMM operator at the non-union Mercedes-Benz plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Jeremy, are you ready to join us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Jeremy Kimbrell. I work at the non-union Mercedes plant in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The plant produces internal combustion engine and hybrid SUVs, as well as completed batteries for the all-electric vehicles that will launch later this year. EVs are definitely the future. We're the exclusive worldwide producer of the GL class of SUVs. The high profit margin of these SUVs, coupled with a high volume, makes our plant an important part of Mercedes-Benz electric future. In fact, the company has invested $1 billion in the last few years to prepare for EV production at our plant. I was 22 years old in 1999 when I started as a temporary employee. I've worked in assembly, paint, quality, and at the battery plant. I'm proud of my work. I have a high voltage certification, which is required to repair hybrid vehicles and is also required to work inside the battery plant to meet the highest safety standards. Though I work at a non-union plant, my dad and grandfather worked as union coal miners in Alabama and taught me the value of unions. I'm supporting a union at Mercedes-Benz in Alabama because without it, we workers aren't getting a fair deal. And as a longtime employee at a non-union auto plant, I believe I can speak to what is at stake in the EV transition if companies like Mercedes continue to prevail in their efforts to deny collective bargaining. Without it, the company's focus on volume and profits too often has a negative effect on our standard of living and quality of life. Politicians like to brag about bringing so many manufacturing jobs into our area, as if manufacturing job is automatically a great job. But in my time at Mercedes, without collective bargaining, the company has driven the quality of these jobs into the dirt to the point where I can in good conscience recommend this job. Starting with the physical nature of the work. It's hard work and can be dangerous. This won't change as we build electric vehicles. The lines move fast, it's very physical, and there's a lot of repetitive physical movements. Since management doesn't focus on breaking up the workload, some jobs get little physical relief, which risk repetitive motion injuries. Sometimes only after an injury, they will make a change. We workers don't have input in this. Now let me talk about the dramatic decline in the standard of living for Mercedes workers since I started. I was fortunate to raise 2 kids at this job. When I started, it paid well enough that I could support a family with one parent staying home to care for the kids. Mandatory weekends were rare, and there was time we could spend as a family. Things have gotten significantly worse. New hires will need both parents working, as the company has imposed a 2-tier system that has driven down real wages for the new employees. It's made health insurance more expensive and weakened their already minimal retirement benefits. Though they raised starting wages recently due to the so-called labor shortage, real wages and overall standard of living are still way behind where they were in my early years. With the recent improvement, new hires started at $20 an hour and reached top pay in 4 years at $25 an hour. In contrast, I made $25 an hour in 2004. So a person hired today will make in the year 2026 what I made in 2004. That is a huge decline in real wages, and that's just the wages. When I started at Mercedes, the insurance was almost free. There were no deductibles and low copays. Now I pay roughly $2,500 a year for the top coverage, extra for copays and deductibles, and 10% co-insurance that we didn't have before. Since we don't have a defined pension plan, the decline in wages reduces retirement benefits since the company contributions are based on the wages. Younger co-workers worry they'll never be able to retire, and others will have to put off retirement beyond their healthiest years where it's not as enjoyable. All these changes mean overall standard of living for a Mercedes worker has gone way down. And because we don't have collective bargaining, all these changes were made without meaningful input from us workers. Besides declining wages and benefits, our overall quality of life as Mercedes workers has also declined significantly in recent years. Constant change in work schedules, frequent unpredictable and mandatory overtime make it very challenging for workers to try to raise a family. I can't imagine raising my kids if I had to do it under these current conditions. This severe unpredictability in work-family balance leads to a high turnover, which then compounds the scheduling challenges for those of us that still work here, and leads to even more mandatory overtime. According to a friend of mine who was assigned to work on new hire orientations, of 2,000 new hires who came in during an 8-month period in 2020 and 2021, only 125 were still employed after 8 months. This kind of turnover hurts morale, productivity, and makes life worse for those still working.
Right.
If
Thank
we're
you,
building electric cars to help sustain our planet, we need to also make sure these jobs can sustain families and the communities we live in. Workers should be allowed to independently choose to use their rights to form a union, bargain collectively for a contract that provides fair, good pay, benefits, retirement, and a quality life that they can appreciate and be proud of. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you. And thank you for your perspective and the perspective of your coworkers and the challenges you face every day. I think it's important for we as investors to hear directly from frontline workers about the tangible impacts on real-time business decisions. So, and we're going to hear next from Scott Moldenauer. Scott is an engineer and serves as chairman and chief steward of UAW Local 212 Engineering Unit at the Stellantis Tech Center in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Scott?
Good morning. So he kind of gave the intro already. I'm Scott Moldenauer. I've been a die engineer at Chrysler for 22 years. Before that, I spent 7 or 8 years jumping from supplier to supplier. So I have an idea of a non-union shop as opposed to coming into a union shop as well. Always in the engineering field from manufacturing. At Chrysler, I'm in the stamping department. So we deal with the panels. So any panel you see on your car, that's what we're working on. And then in terms of chairman, I have the assembly engineers too. So they're the ones that put the car together at the end. But I deal mostly with panels in my design function. I also did some time as a facilitator when I joined, obviously being in the union for these 22 years, I gravitated toward the union. I became a facilitator on the joint programs team, and the joint programs was something that we do to voice our concerns together with management, and we work together on different issues in the plant. I was part of the product quality improvement team as a facilitator. And then 5 years from then, I became the chairman or alternate chairman, and then eventually the elected chairman. So I've been the elected chairman for the last 10 years. So I've got a lot of experience working with management on issues when it comes to joint concerns as we go through the group. So some of the things that Jeremy pointed out from not maybe having a voice, in terms of jobs that I've had over the years, this has been the best one that I've ever had in terms of pay, benefits, having a voice to bring up concerns when you talk about issues on the floor, especially when it comes to safety concerns. We have the opportunity to escalate issues. And if I can't escalate it there, I can do it without reprisal. I can escalate it up to a VP. I can escalate it to my VP to help if I need that type of support. But most of the time we can handle it within our individual groups. So in my organization in engineering, there's 10 directors that I deal with because I got all the engineering functions. So a director at Stellantis is like a plant manager. So in Jeremy's case, he's dealing probably with one plant manager. I'm dealing with 10, but we all have to be on the same page and have these discussions when it comes to safety concerns, especially when we're engineering things out. So we don't have ergo issues or we don't have safety concerns with the people in the plant. The good news is having that voice, which was good. We can press on them to make sure that they keep a constant safe environment. The other thing, we are changing to electric. You heard Tavares, Carlos Tavares is our new CEO of Stellantis. We've gone through a bunch of name changes over the years. So I've worked for 5 different companies and haven't changed at all in 22 years. So we have a lot of name changes. So Stellantis is the new one. And Carlos just did his update last week where he talked about the EV strategy going forward and big plans, right? So he's talking about being net zero within by 2030, actually by 2038, being net zero by 2030 being halfway there, right? 50% net zero from a carbon emission standpoint. And then from an EV strategy, he's talking about having 75 vehicles in an EV capacity, 50 of them over in Europe, with Europe going totally 100% by 2030 and 25 in the United States, putting us at 50%. Almost every one of our vehicles, which he sort of announced was going to have some sort of hybrid or EV background. So from an environment standpoint, the companies are all going that direction from the big three, and obviously from the other non-union suppliers. So we all have that in mind when we're going forward. But like I said, the big push is they want to get the revenues up as part of their goals. They want to keep the profit up, which today a lot of our membership got a huge profit sharing check because we did very well from a margin standpoint. So everybody was excited from that revenue. And going forward, Mr. Taveras is also part of his plan is to keep that margin and revenue and profit up. From a union standpoint, that's a good deal. We also have collective bargaining where we can collectively bargain for a profit sharing. We can collectively bargain for wages. Having that, like I said, in these 22 years that I've been here, it's been the best job I've ever had. I enjoyed working with the people. I've enjoyed, even though sometimes it's a back and forth with my 10 directors that they have to deal with from a back and forth standpoint, and we don't always love each other. But we do end up working things out. And again, if we have to escalate, we escalate. At the end of the day, I can do that without reprisal. I don't have to fear having to bring something up that may be a safety concern in the plant that could hurt people in the plant. So to me, the joint program was a big piece of it. One example that we've had just recently is we had a safety discussion during the pandemic. We've been doing a lot of Zoom meetings like we're doing somewhat here. So the safety discussion was centering on, we hadn't done an update to our lockout training. So when our engineers and when our plant personnel have to go into a cell or machinery in our plants, they have to have a lock that they put on the machine to show that it's turned off. And anybody who enters has to have that lock and put it on. So everybody that's going in has to have the lock. They have to put it on. They have to make sure they're in the cell, and they have to be authorized to go into that cell. Well, there's a training mechanism that goes along with that. That training is kind of lapsed because we've all been at home, other than going into the plants, but you're supposed to keep a constant update on that authorization for the training. During that conversation this past year, one of the directors just said, well, let's just give everybody a lock. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Not everybody goes into these tools all the time. There's certain people that are in them all the time. They should be authorized. And then anybody else that goes in should be an adjunct user that has to be with an authorized user going in. Well, the director was trying to make it easy on himself because he's got a big group of people and he just wants to just give them locks, and that way I can send anybody I want in there. Well, that's an issue from the union standpoint and from the safety standpoint. So when we brought it up and got health and safety together and we talked about it, we ended up coming to an agreement that no, we're going to stick to the way we were doing it before. We're going to have authorized users. They're going to get update training on their authorization. And then the people that are adjunct will get theirs every 3 years, and they can only enter a cell or a machine with someone that's authorized. So that, to me, that's one of those discussions that, it was a back and forth with the director that wanted it because he just wanted it for the ease of sending whoever engineer he wanted. But my concern was, when you send somebody in there that's never been in a cell before, because now he's authorized and really he's never worked on that system, you're putting somebody in a bad spot where they could get hurt. So those are the type of examples that we have in our teams. It's good stuff. Like I said, it's hit and miss. Sometimes we don't always love each other, but it works out. Thank you.
Scott, thank you very much for that perspective. And thank you for making the trip here to DC, because once again, I think it's important that people hear this perspective. We've heard from a couple of people who work with UAW. Our next speaker, Cindy Estrada, serves as the Vice President of the United Auto Workers. Cindy, I know you have a lot to share. Would you share with the group?
I know, I'm nervous. I only have 7 minutes. So, but
I
I want to
cut into that.
I want to thank just for being here. It's such an opportunity. We know we're in an environmental crisis right now, but we're also in a crisis of inequality and a crisis of racial injustice. And one of the things that I want to talk about as we look at this transition into EV and greening the economy, there's also, I think, a narrative that needs to be broken first. And, there is this narrative out there that a manufacturing job is a good job. And part of that's coming from the fact that we have UAW workers like Scott, across the country, probably like 150,000 workers in the UAW who have really bargained over the years for high standards. You know, we have apprenticeship programs that make sure that there's not discrimination in them, that we're putting women into apprenticeship programs, that we're putting, you know, African Americans into apprenticeship programs, you know, Latinos. And so we're making sure that we have really great health and safety that Scott spoke to. But the false narrative is that just happens on its own, that automatically that's a good job. The truth is that manufacturing is in a lot of ways, a bad job. The wages are very low. The average worker out there, you know, and I think this has even changed as of COVID, you know, is making like $11, $12 an hour. And as you heard from Jeremy, you know, that isn't even the real wage when they go home, because they're paying co-pays and co-insurance. And so their real check is a lot lower. We often find workers in manufacturing working 2 and 3 jobs, working a full day and walking into a food stamp line. So with that, you know, it's a challenge, because we have to really break that narrative that what makes it a good job is the fact that workers have a union, have a right to collectively bargain, not just for their wages and benefits, but for the health and safety. No one knows the shop floor better than workers who are on it every day. They really can. From an investment perspective, you want their input, right? Because you don't want to have a problem at the beginning of line. You want to have the problem at the beginning of the line and not at the end, where it's going to cost a company a lot more money to fix it. And workers in a union can say that. Jeremy's, you know, team has to be nervous about saying that, because they don't have democracy in workplace and they don't have protection. So you don't want to really make a manager angry. In our shops, if a worker doesn't feel comfortable raising a problem, whether it's around health and safety or quality, they can go to Scott, and he's their representative. So, but one of the things I'm nervous about is this challenge, is that we can end up doing this transition in lower workplace standards. If you look at right now, there's 20 battery plants that are coming online and there's no union. When you hear CEOs talk, you know, and I appreciate the work, you know, that we do with our CEOs, but when you hear that battery workers are going to make $16 and $17 an hour, and our engine workers are currently making 30 plus really good wages and benefits, that's concerning. When you know that the battery is probably like $8,000 and labor cost is a fraction of that, maybe $250 to meet our wages and benefits, yet they're saying we need to be competitive, when we know the problem with the battery is not the labor cost, it's in the materials, which is why companies need the subsidy. And so, you know, we have right now the Amazon, you know, we look at the workers out there, low wages. We have companies like Tesla fighting workers' rights, you know, spending millions of dollars on anti-union campaigns. We see a lot of production moving to the South, where we have, you know, governors and people at the state, you know, elected officials at the state level, you know, passing right to work laws. You know, it's putting a lot, we don't have to, when workers want to form a union like Jeremy, it's not the company they have to worry about, it's the whole infrastructure that's coming after them to make sure that, you know, they don't have democracy. You shouldn't have to punch out of democracy when you punch into an auto plant. One, it's not safe, it's bad for productivity. And as Jeremy said, the turnover is like very, very high, because workers aren't making enough to think this could be a living. And that matters, right? If we don't get this right, you know, we're in an environmental crisis. I have 2 18-year-old boys, and it really scares the heck out of me to think of the world they're going to walk into. It scares what our workers are going to walk into. And so we have to really make sure that we get this right, or other politicians are going to use this for their own purposes to say, going green means building back worse. Going green means bad jobs. And we know that that doesn't have to be. If we all get in a room together, we could figure out, you know, we want to make sure 40% of the workers are Black and brown in the South in these manufacturing jobs. You know, we want to see that racial injustice is addressed. Right? When companies get subsidies, we want to make sure that those communities, you know, the children that are, you know, are going to school are breathing air that's safe, making sure that when their parents come home from work, they're not coming home injured, or worse, which happens all the time, is workers die. Right? People go home, you know, a father doesn't show up or a mother doesn't show up. But what's exciting is, while there's these challenges, there's opportunities. We have an administration that is understanding that we're only better if workers have a voice in their workplace. We have administration right now who understands that, you know, inequality is tied to racial injustice and that we need to fix that. And so we're very fortunate that we have others that are talking about the broken labor law, right? Jeremy would have a union today if a company didn't spend millions of dollars, with half truths about what it means to be union. And so we have others now that are understanding, both in the investment world, in communities, in elected positions, where we have to fix our labor law, that and we have investors that are starting to understand that. Do you really want your company spending millions? The shareholders really want their company spending millions of dollars fighting workers when they could just have a process where they allow them to sign a union card, where they allow them to make a choice and save a whole lot of money and really focus on quality, health and safety, and a good product for the customers at the end of the day. So that's, one of the asks I have, here is, how do we get board seats where people understand that it's an environmental crisis, it's a crisis of inequality, and it's a crisis of racial injustice? How do we help make sure that people understand that? How do we get board members that understand that this transition is happening at lightning speed? And if we don't get it right, then we're going to have whole communities devastated and workers still working full-time and walking into food stamp lines. How do we push that this majority sign up and card check, whatever you want to call it, a way that allows workers a fair process without having to fight an anti-union campaign? And I think we can do this. I'm excited. It's going to take a whole hell of a lot of work. But if we all in these rooms stand together and demand it, it can happen. So that was more than 7 minutes, and I'm sorry.
Great. Cindy, thank you very much for that perspective. Next, I'm joined by Ramon Cruz, president of Sierra Club. I am genuinely happy to say I'm seated between representative of the UAW and the president of Sierra Club. 15 years ago, I'm not sure I would have wanted to be in this position. But Ramon, I'll turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Michael. And yeah, indeed, it is great to be in this panel and together with Cindy. I think, hopefully, 15 years ago, perhaps. But I think we have done great advances towards that. We're a founding member of the Blue Green Alliance, for example, that joins environmental organizations with labor unions, and this is key not only to advance environmental policies, but for the economy. To remain competitive as a economy. In globally in the global setting. So yeah, and all of that is very important. Anyway, well, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to join the Sierra Club. For those of you who do not know, it's the largest and oldest environmental organization. We have been around 130 years, and it has been a very fundamental organization in the conservation of nature, but also advancing environmental policies, environmental justice as well. And yeah, so why are we here? We're here because transportation, and especially clean transportation, is very important for us. As Michael mentioned, almost a third of the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced in the U.S. Comes from the transportation sector, and so as well, transportation is not only the technological advances that we're seeing, but also how we plan cities. The suburbanization or land use policies also affect the way we affect the environment. And it's not only greenhouse gases, but also more locally emissions, like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides that affect communities. And usually the communities that suffer the most from these are the most vulnerable in society, are what we call environmental justice communities, or that are low-income communities of color often. And so it is important to have that in mind, because I guess that the environmental justice aspect is fundamental, to fight the climate crisis. Often we think that, well, it is okay to say, let's frag the hell out of an area, pollute a watershed, to be sure that the economy as a whole, it's in good condition, but so we're willing to often sacrifice these areas on behalf, of the well-being of society as a whole. But if we're willing to sacrifice those areas, then the people in those areas become disposable, no? And we cannot really think of disposable people unless we're also have an ideology based on supremacy and racial injustice and inequality and racism. So, so all of these, to say that when we think of the environment, we can not only think of, nature and that's it. We have to think of the people in those places, no, and the people that we're affecting. And so all of that, comes together because now that we're in this big push to develop electric vehicles in this economy, in this country, we need to also be conscious of that, and there are several ramifications of, in that aspect. I hope I get a cue when. So, but yeah, we need to ensure that these voices are heard in the development of this industry, because it's not only ensuring that the manufacturing jobs are benefiting these communities, but also the infrastructure that is developing. So, you can see often how the first to access, for example, electric vehicles would be wealthier communities. And therefore, the focus on the infrastructure is there. So there you have then a lot of the, plants and the extracting industry and everything affecting these communities, and they're not even really reaping the benefits of that. So all of that is very important. And so when it comes to creating policies that would affect that or that would benefit, that we have now an administration that has been really focused on that and creating policies, like what I guess used to be called Build Back Better, and we haven't given up that fight to get those policies in place and those programs and incentives. But Justice 40, for example, to reinvest in those communities that are mostly affected, the PRO Act, and so there are many things that I think this is the right moment to really be talking about that. Beyond that, the competitive, like other foreign companies are already investing in this. And so we have to be sure that, the affordability of these vehicles are right for our communities and our consumers, so that they don't turn into other, vehicles that might be cheaper, more affordable. No, so we need to ensure that it's a whole of the government and whole of the economy approach on this. How am I doing on time? Still okay. Good. So what can companies do? Again, not only when focusing on this is also ensure that not only manufacturing but dealers, offer these vehicles, prioritize these, and get ahead of the game, so that we ensure that the U.S. economy really benefits and the consumers benefit for this. And then finally, investors, follow recommendations of the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which for those of you who do not know, then it's an assessment of 100+, 160 companies around the world, which account for 80% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions. So specifically, the automotive companies, there's a dozen or so assessed there, and none of the manufacturers have established short-term or medium-term commitments, that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So, it's something that the industry needs to be there. That's the future. That's, and the companies that are ahead of the game will be in much better position. So I'll stop there, and then hopefully there will be more discussion. So
Great.
thank you.
Ramon, thank you. We're trying to make sure we have some time for question and answers at the end here. Those of us who are investors, we know that these are not easy questions to answer. That's why we look at things in an ESG approach. There are a lot of things to consider. We've heard from Ramon with environmental issues. We've heard from UAW with workers' issues. And although workers' rights are human rights, our next speaker, Richard Kent, be joining us from Zoom as a researcher and advisor of human rights and energy transitions at Amnesty International in London. So Richard, thanks for joining us.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Michael and the SOC Investment Group for inviting me. It's a shame I can't be there in person, given that's now possible, but yeah, hopefully next time. So for those of you who don't know, Amnesty International is the largest human rights movement and organization in the world. We have 7 million members internationally, all over the world, on all continents. And the business human rights team that I work for at Amnesty, we have some 20 years of working on extractive industries, due diligence in the supply chain and around the mining industry, but also doing a lot of work on the international brands that source minerals and other commodities, and make sure that they're respecting human rights in their supply chains. So really what I'm going to talk about is as much just transition from the perspective of workers in the supply chain, harm, at the level of industrial mining, and what the EV industry can and the automobile industry can do about that. So Amnesty, we also do a lot of work on standard setting and advocacy. So we're doing a lot of work on the European Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive at the EU level, but also we have forthcoming regulation on the battery industry in Europe, and this will apply to all companies placing batteries on the internal market of the European Union. And there's actually a vote happening today in the European Parliament. And if passed, it will have very strict due diligence requirements on, labor rights, free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples, water, land degradation, respecting the conflict minerals guidance, etc. So it's a very extensive piece of legislation. Amnesty, last year we published a set of recommendations for governments and businesses in the battery value chain called Powering Change, that was also aimed at investors. And it really gives an overview of the kind of risks that the EV and automobile industry faces in the battery value chain. And it's based on quite an expansive interpretation of the United Nations guiding principles and the OECD guidance for multinational enterprises, which is really the foundation of a lot of what the business and human rights team does. And it's also a reflection that we believe that environmental rights and human rights are essentially the same thing, and that we can't see, we don't see any separation between human rights and the energy transition. They must go hand in hand, and the energy transition needs to ensure that the rights of workers, whether it's at plants in the US or workers at industrial mines around the world, that those rights are respected. So the Powering Change was endorsed by 70 civil society groups from all over the world. Many of them input into this the recommendations on issues of how to do due diligence on water, how to ensure that communities are properly consulted around the cobalt and the nickel, copper, lithium mines. And the principles, it's as I mentioned, it's to reaffirm that human rights and environmental rights are completely inseparable. And now we decided to then take it a step further and assess. We're now in the process of assessing companies on the extent to which they implement the Powering Change principles. So we're going to be publishing a battery scorecard, and we are ranking and assessing 18 of the world's largest EV and battery manufacturers on a whole range of human and environmental rights. And there is quite a significant, very significant discrepancies in terms of transparency that the companies offer. You know, how the way that they engage with labor rights at mine level, the extent to which they're doing due diligence on child labor, which Amnesty has done a lot of work on around the cobalt mines in the DRC in particular, and really the amount of time that they expend engaging with these rights at the mine level. And we've found generally the companies that invest more time at the mine level, they're going to score a lot better. But it's really all about transparency. How am I doing on time here?
A minute or two.
So, as much as
I'm sure we could all listen for a while, but we should make sure we save some time for question and answers.
Yeah.
Being a moderator is awful. Cutting people off who actually have good information, but you know, make sure we get a chance for everyone to.
But just to underscore that the power and change principles, they're really also designed for investors to, you know, kind of look at the main criteria, if it's on free, prior, and informed consent, community consultation, making sure that the battery value chain is free from egregious human rights abuse, and it's as much about the way that the electric vehicle companies communicate the way they are identifying, mitigating, preventing the risks in line with the United Nations guiding principles. So yeah, perhaps I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Richard, thank you very much. Now's that time that I get sort of the payback for being that annoying guy who tries to interrupt people and tells them to speed things up. And now it's time for question and answers. For our in-person or for our online people, our in-person will have roving mics. I got someone on the other side of the room here. Make sure you ask your question into the mic so the people who are watching online or remotely can hear your question. And if there is someone online, Dieter will let me know.
Hi there. So a little over 100 years ago, Henry Ford went to his board and said, I want to pay my workers more because turnover is my biggest expense. He wanted to triple their wages. And his board thought this was the craziest idea they'd ever heard. So what Henry Ford did was he went back into the market, bought up enough shares so that he could fire the board members and do what he wanted to do. Now, this is a terrible governance story. But in the next 3 years, he doubled his profits. And Henry Ford was not a nice guy. He didn't actually care about the workers. He wanted to make money. And he knew that solving the workers' problem would help him make money. Why don't people remember this?
Great question. Anyone on the panel like to attempt?
Because they're making a hell of a lot of money still. Right? And you know, I think that's one issue. It's like what happens when workers don't have disposable income if we create this, you know, new green economy and workers can't buy the products. I mean, it's the same, you know, the same old story, but I think inequality is out of control, right? And you know, and just to point out, he did do all that, and I appreciate you saying he really didn't care about the workers because he fought the union for a long time after that. But the turnover piece is really critical. When workers have a voice, he knew that he also knew that though when workers had a voice, quality would go up, which would help his profits.
Well, I think he also knew that if you didn't pay your workers a decent wage, they wouldn't be able to buy your products.
Yeah.
And yeah. Okay, I think Dieter said we had one online, and then I saw a hand in the back.
So here's a question. People can see this. So what is? Oh, you can read it a picture.
Michael, batteries from electric cars when they die out are the components of the vehicle battery being neutralized. Does anyone on this panel know the answer to that? I do not.
Well, not that I know the answer, because, you know, ultimately the recycling industry in general, it's sort of like reconfiguring itself. You know, you had 25 years of everything basically heading towards China. And when China just a couple of years ago, stopped receiving, now their purchasing power, their middle class is growing, their consumption, they produce enough waste now to really, close that loop. So it is really a wake-up call for the industry and an opportunity for industry in other places, including the United States, to do that. Now, beyond that, what it's important, especially now that we're mass producing, electric vehicles, is also making sure that companies are looking at closing that loop as well, no? And like seeing as, the whole product, and be also responsible for recycling that. So, in terms of innovation and invention, we have to do much better, but also making companies responsible for that, so that, you don't have all these toxic materials ending up in, our landfills, and of course, then affecting the most vulnerable communities.
Yeah, right. I think there was a hand in the back up first, and then we'll come towards the front.
Can you hear me okay? So we're engaging workers around the just transition at the Teamsters Union. And I'm just wondering, to what degree does that concept resonate with workers? Obviously workers are concerned about paychecks, but we up here are talking about the just transition, suturing together this environmental concern and this inequality and economic concern. But is that a concept which resonates with folks on the ground that they can mobilize? And I'm just thinking of the two workers on the panel.
Yeah, Jeremy, you want to go first? From my perspective, people do, so you brought up the EV thing. So that discussion on the floor is happening. Where does the waste go? It's the $1 million question, I think, out in the nation. So I'm not surprised that came up as a question. So the people are talking about that. And from an engineering standpoint, I can tell you, we have people looking at how do we make sure we have recyclable and means to do that. Now, they still, when we go with the collective bargaining, paychecks and things like that are always number one and number two on the list when it comes to pay, because that's what immediately affects what the people are getting. But from the EV standpoint, and from having a safety and an environmental impact, people, they're talking about it. It ain't number one or two, but it is something that we talk about on the floor. And again, from the recycling standpoint, that is a number one issue that we are studying. And what can we do to make sure we have recyclability on these batteries? Because at some point they're going to run out, and then what?
I think we have another online, and then we'll move to the front here. I'll see. Let's see if we're going to order. What is being done for? Nope. Please make sure to indicate where. All right, then let me go to one more. Haven't learned much on the huge retraining that the transitions to EV will require. Can you comment on this? Are companies prepared? What are unions doing on this subject?
So no, I don't think anyone's prepared. I think, in our union shops, there's discussions, ongoing discussions to try and figure this out. But I think this is it leads to a larger question. Like, if we're really going to do this, we have a lot of rhetoric happening, and it's good rhetoric, but we need, to get to substance. And I think that, I'm a big proponent of how do we pull companies in, environmental groups and labor in, that we have a really hard discussion, and it's going to take a tremendous amount of meetings to really figure out how we all do this together. I feel like that is what has to happen. It needs to happen quickly, and we should all be demanding it, because to think that we're going to figure out the training, and some of it we will, but to do it on a really large scale, it's going to take multiple, stakeholders coming into the room, and workers have to be a part of that, because they are, to my point before, Scott's of the world and Jeremy, they know more on how to do this transition. They're training constantly in their plants, but it's going to take engineering and all of that to come together. And I still think we need to move that quickly, and we need to demand that everyone gets in a room instead of everyone getting in a press conference.
And from an engineering standpoint, we do have training metrics that we run to. And so now we have an EV plan going forward. Those conversations are happening right now, because you got to train your workforce to be able to handle the electric and the battery systems, and that'll require training. So from the joint program standpoint, we are talking about that, because if they're 2 years out, we're already working on them in engineering. So from that perspective, we are talking about that discussion on how training will happen, and it needs to happen quickly.
Great panel. I'm Erin from the Laborers Union, and my observation at this CII is there's all these investors who are engaging on climate, and they've got a real easy metric to judge companies by. They're asking them about emissions. And so it's like a black-white issue. How are you doing on emissions? And so I'm curious in terms, if you guys have these investors going in to engage companies, and let's just say in the auto industry, what's the metric they should be leaning in on the transition? If we want to start getting data out there that we can all benchmark these companies on, like who's doing a good job, who's doing a bad job, what are the metrics you guys would want to see? Cynthia, I was struck by the wage differential between combustion engine and batteries. Should we all be pushing and leaning in on what is that wage metric? I'd be curious your insight.
So I think one metric is, I mean, it's a real simple metric, right? If there's not democracy in the workplace, then workers aren't able to be at the table when wages and benefits, health and safety, quality is huge, right? Our members, the amazing work, they're catching those problems on the shop floor. And I'm not saying that's not happening in non-union shops, but to really differentiate what it's like for a worker who isn't protected by a contract, who is an at-will employee, to stand up and confront when there's an issue on the floor, whether it be around health and safety or quality or just discrimination. Right? They're just not going to do that. I think Jeremy would agree. That's much harder to do when you don't have the protection of a contract. So I think that's one piece. And so I think asking whether or not they have those kinds of standards is important. And then I think, we have to make sure there's 11 non-union companies right now building vehicles, only and three union. And so we stand to lose that standard that's already been built. And I think we have to be really careful of that and ask companies, right? If they're saying they're gonna take an engine job that's eventually going to be transferred to a battery job, and they're saying it's going to be $16 and $17 an hour, that's an issue. That is not building back better. If that's that is building back worse. So I think those are the kinds of questions that have to be asked. We should be improving standards, not decreasing them.
Yeah, I would like to add something. For investors, I think another metric that it's not often discussed is the political and lobbying budgets of many companies. Because it amazes me, how much effort and how much money goes into fighting, clean car standards. If we would have used that energy and budgets in development, we would be much better off. We would be ahead of the game instead of staying behind from other companies. So, I guess that transparency is very important for investors to really try to influence how these companies, start moving ahead of the game into the 21st century instead of doing that. That is important because, now I guess the car, and light vehicles, it's there, but we're going to see, I am afraid, the same dynamic that we saw that with truck and heavy duty vehicles, and so we should be learning from those mistakes from the past. And, instead of fighting for a decade on that, we should be actually looking into the future. So.
One of the things I've learned in my time in politics is it's very popular to say, we want change, but change is hard. And for boards of directors, it's easier to continue with the same way sometimes than it is to push change. And that's why we all come here today at CII, because I think there are a lot of us who realize that they may need a little extra help moving forward. And so I know we have more questions out there, but I would like to close out the lightning round because we do have other panels today. So before we end, I'd like to do a lightning round with Richard, Cindy, and Ramon. Can each of you provide your thoughts as to what investors can do to address the risks we've talked about today? And maybe try and answer a couple minutes each. Let's start with Richard. Richard, we'll go back to you online. There you go.
I would say that the investors they need to use their leverage really to try to create more transparency from some of the actors in the automobile industry, the EV industry, in the supply chain. And they need to really be asking tough questions. If there is no disclosure about how automobile companies engage with communities, in mineral producing countries, if there is no disclosure on, free prior informed consent protocols, how they go about the process of sourcing hundreds of thousands of tons of minerals. You know, it's a red flag. And generally, we've found that in our scorecard, the companies that have done a lot better are the ones that are closer to the point of extraction and engage more at the mine level. So yeah, I think investors need to keep asking tough questions. We know they don't have as much time to do thorough due diligence as, you know, the EV and the automobile industry itself. But, you know, there are certain red flags on free prior informed consent, environmental impact assessments, child labor, etc.
Thank you, Richard. Ramon, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I spoke in my last intervention about the political activities that, you know, of companies that are very relevant in terms of, you know, being transparent, being, you know, ensuring that their policies, their business plans, et cetera, are consistent with a zero, you know, vehicles goal that we have. And then, you know, I think supporting these frontline communities that are going to be hopefully hosting many of these manufacturing hubs, you know, and be sure that their voices are heard in that just transition, in that transition towards a clean economy, and ultimately, you know, apply a lens that takes into consideration environmental justice, you know, into the investments that you're doing, into the policies that you're supporting. And yeah, I think that is what it will take us there. Thank you.
I hear applause next door, so we're ending right around time. But Cindy, don't rush, but your
No,
thoughts.
very quickly, I think that workers need a fair process to form a union so that they can have democracy in the workplace. And I think that has to be something outside of a broken labor law system like the NLRB. And so that workers like Jeremy, who have been fighting for so long to have a real voice in their union, have that opportunity to do that instead of going through year-long fights and legal battles that, you know, again, justice delayed is justice denied. So I would say to push them to have that kind of fair democracy in the workplace is not a bad thing. If it's good for our country, it's good for the workers who walk into those plants every day.
What great words to end with. I want to thank our panelists for their time here today, for their time traveling here.